12.
And we're on.
All right, good afternoon and welcome back to the House Environment and Energy Committee. We're going to continue our testimony on H687 with Billy Coster from A&R. Welcome back, Billy.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Happy Valentine's Day. My name is Billy Coster. I'm the Director of Planning and Policy for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. I've been asked to come in to speak to the critical resource area elements of H687. And I'm just gonna try to get my slides up here on the Zoom if you give me one quick second. Apologies, I will have it. There we go. Just one second. This has some links in it. That's why I want to get it up there. So. Beautiful. Okay. So if it's okay with the committee, my plan is to speak briefly about the process that I participated in with the NRB study this summer, looking at a similar concept of critical resource areas, tier 3, talk about how the bill currently in this committee addresses the topic, compare, contrast, and then talk about a couple different potential pathways to further refine the concept to an outcome that the agency would be supportive of. And I'll try to do that quickly and welcome questions at any point. So just, I'm going to run through this background relatively quickly, so feel free to stop me. But as I think you're all aware, Act 182 of 2022 charged the Natural Resources Board to complete a study that spoke to a number of issues. The first one that's emboldened here is focused on jurisdictional, place-based jurisdiction and exploration of the concept of a tiered set of jurisdictional triggers. That is what this group worked on. They did recommend a 3-tier system that is in concept very similar to what is being proposed in H687. That group, as I think you've seen, but just to refresh, comprised a number of individuals with deep expertise and experience working in Act 250 from the environmental advocacy, the planning, the development, the natural resources, and municipal angles. And the list of those steering committee members are included in my slides here. The NRB also invited over 60 Vermonters in addition to that steering committee to participate in focus groups that were affinity groups focused on 7 different topical areas. And those 60 individuals met regularly over the course of our work and advised us on specific topics as we considered it. So it was a robust project process. It had a lot of folks with deep experience in Act 250 and a lot of stakeholders. And what that study ultimately recommended as with regards to jurisdiction is a tiered location-based system that has 3 tiers. A planned growth area tier that's comprised of 1A and 1B, a tier 2, which is effectively the status quo of Act 250 jurisdictional triggers with the addition of an updated road rule, and then a tier 3, which is an area of automatic Act 250 jurisdiction targeting areas with specific natural resource values. Turn this off so I stop getting emails. And since I'm here today to talk about tier 3 or critical resource areas, that's what I'm going to focus on. That committee, we looked at this issue hard. This is something that's been part of the Act 250 modernization conversation since at least the Commission on Act 250. It's featured in the report that commission issued. And it's something that this broader framework of relaxed Act 250 jurisdiction in places where we want to see growth and has the necessary bylaws and systems in place, countered by areas where there's really significant natural resource value or risk that we want to see additional Act 250 oversight has been in the conversation for many years now. And this group of experienced practitioners came together. We did look at a number of different concepts, existing map layers of how we might divine what that critical resource area or tier 3 might look like. And we frankly struggled. None of the existing there was no consensus that any of the existing kind of mapped resource areas or any combination of them immediately lent themselves to a good Act 250 jurisdictional tier. And for a number of reasons. Many of the ones that we've looked at, many of the ones that have been discussed in this committee are essentially vast. They cover hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres in the state. And I think that the NRB group felt that tier three certainly shouldn't be a one-to-one comparison with the planned growth area, but there needed to be some relativity between the size of this area of new automatic jurisdiction and the area planned for exemptions. And these hot links in my testimony, provide some sense of the scope of these areas across the state. I'm not going to go into them unless folks have questions, but encourage you to look at these maps.
Representative Sakowitz has a question.
Yeah, why is it important why is the relative size of the areas important?
For a couple of reasons. I think for many people, for our purpose from an agency, and I think what a lot of people felt is that Act 250 is a pretty significant regulatory framework. It has 10 criteria, 32 sub-criteria. It requires a significant investment of public resources and state staff to administer. And it asks a lot of landowners. They have to provide more information, engage in more process than they would to obtain permits locally. There's also a number of other state permits that address environmental impacts to natural resources that we didn't see the need to be duplicative of. And we really felt that tier three would be most successfully deployed if it was targeted to places that really were critical and at risk, and not, a third, half the state that, which some of these maps, or even, 20% of the state, which some of these existing layers include. So from our perspective, as a regulatory agency, we don't think it's necessary to basically duplicate local land use regulation in vast portions of the state. We're happy to lend our capacity and resources towards targeted strategic regulation of places that really matter. And how you define that really matter is difficult, but that's the construct, that it doesn't certainly need to be as narrow as those areas for planned growth, but there was a lot of discomfort amongst the stakeholders around some of these resource categories that are, hundreds of thousands of acres, millions of acres.
Yeah, no, I understand that the absolute size is an issue, but you made a point of contrasting the size of this versus the size of the planned growth areas. And so my question is really, how are those connected? How is the size of one connected to the size of the other? Why is that important?
I think there's a perception that there's somewhat of a balance that the public is trying to strike here, that if there is going to be areas that are exempted for growth, that there will be areas where jurisdiction is increased, and that the relative nature of those should be somewhat close. That's just the sentiment that a lot of the folks in the steering committee had voiced.
So it's based upon some perception?
Yeah, and authorize an environment, what the public expects and has communicated up through the members of this group. So, yeah.
No, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to be respectful of you getting through what you want to share with us. And I have a question for you on this too. You said public resources and state staff go into kind of administering Act 250. We just took testimony on Housing Conservation Day about state staff and state dollars going into private road remediation after the fact, after development has gone to a single house down a driveway. And I guess, is anyone tracking the costs of that kind of remediation to cumulative costs of them?
You're talking flood recovery type things?
Yeah, state dollars going to fix a driveway.
I believe there have been some after action assessments following the summer's floods that looked at some of those things. I don't have any information in front of me. Those are kind of one-time event driven costs. We're certainly seeing more and more of those. I'm speaking through the just standing obligation of a large regulatory agency to do this work. We're at the current levels of Act 250 jurisdiction. We are pretty spread thin trying to provide district commissions, communities, and applicants the sort of technical assistance analysis that we provide under a range of criteria. If the number of Act 250 applications we would have to review would increase significantly and in areas where there wasn't a tremendous amount of natural resource impact, that would stretch, that would be a hard thing for us to manage under current resources. That's.
And I respect that, and I'm looking forward to getting to your punchline of what you think are those resources. But I just think that this session in particular has really started to put a fine point on the cumulative impacts and costs of dispersed development, whether it's for energy or for land use, that we are bearing repeatedly and more frequently. And we're going to have to start accounting for that.
Absolutely. And I'll just add that we're in the process at ANR in developing a municipal vulnerability assessment tool, which we're going to hopefully launch in the coming year to help towns work with their citizens to figure out where those risks exist and hopefully plan better. And I think we're going to see a lot of both study, action, and investment in the resilience space to try to address those things preemptively going forward.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. When will that tool have a first cut ready that you could share with us?
I just got an email invitation for a presentation to the Climate Council, I think next week. I'll follow up with you afterwards, but I know it's in the works. I don't know the exact time.
Thanks.
Okay, so, so ultimately what this kind of broad group of stakeholders agreed to in a consensus report is that there wasn't a clear silver bullet, a clear set of maps or resources that emerged as an acceptable automatic trigger. There was ideas, there was thoughts, but where the group landed is that more work is necessary to look at the data that we have, to incorporate trends around where we're seeing growth, where we're seeing fragmentation, and to work with our communities to come up with an appropriate tier 3. I'm just going to cite, and here's the language that came directly from the report. This is, again, a consensus report that the regional planning commissions, VNRC, district coordinators from Act 250, district commissioners, developers, others participated in ANR, that tier 3 is intended to be a subset of our ecologically important areas, that to develop it will require further analysis, good science, good mapping, public engagement, and that tier 3 would apply to relatively small areas. It goes on further to talk about a process to develop these areas that would involve an analysis of existing maps and work done by the regional planning commissions with support from ANR and others to work with their communities to identify them. And I think you've heard from Mr. Baker and others around, what they see the kind of outlines of that process to be. So just in sum, the NRB study said, do these 3 tiers. Tier 3 is important. It needs some more work to nail down. Turning to the bill that's before this committee, H687, it does include an automatic Act 250 trigger for critical resource areas. I believe the most current definition is up on the screen here, having recently struck the elevational component of it. Like the information that we've reviewed in the study committee, this trigger does include areas that are potentially expansive, areas of prime ag soil, a couple 100,000 acres, connecting habitat, potentially north of a couple million. There's areas that are already regulated, like significant wetlands and whatnot. So I think some of the same concerns that were raised by the study committee apply here. And I think lead to the same conclusion that while this list of resources is a great start, the other things that planners should be looking at as they determine what the ultimate bounds of tier 3 or critical resource areas should be, more work is necessary to do that analysis. So how do we get there? I guess I'll start with an analogy. Your bill currently, H687 currently includes the concept of a planned growth area. And this is a tier where Act 250 would effectively be exempt to promote growth. And that provision of the bill has 11 requirements for an area to qualify as a tier 1A plant growth area. So you don't get the tier 1A designation if just one of those apply. You need to hit all 11 of those criteria to qualify. Alternatively, the critical resource area approach has a half a dozen or so criteria, and if just one of those apply, it triggers jurisdiction. So there's a different approach there, and I just would offer that this idea, like under the planned growth approach, where you need to stack multiple criteria to qualify, is a pretty common approach to identify important areas to protect. You know, where you may have important habitat as well as connecting functions and important species and underlying geology that supports significant natural communities. As those different attributes stack up in certain places, their relative significance and ecological contribution typically does increase. So there may very well be an opportunity to use the resource classifications that you've already identified in the critical resource area and others, including risk-based criteria, such as data related to new E911 addresses, data that looks at recent subdivision trends that BNRC has collected, to really do this values and risk-based stacking to help identify where these areas are in different regions of the state. That's a really data-rich and technically complicated analysis, and it's going to take time. That's the drawback. And what I'm recommending, what our agency is recommending, that's what's necessary, is that we fully support the concept of critical resource areas. We agree that additional Act 250 oversight of parts of the state that are at high risk for impact and that maintain really important and critical natural resources is appropriate. We just believe that to do that right, it's going to need a little bit more analysis and time. And there's two rough ways in our view to get there. One is to provide the regional planning commissions what's effectively a menu of resources to consider. You could start with the list that you currently have in your bill, and we could work with you to suggest others and say, look at these dozen or so attributes in your regions, and you work with your communities, with state agencies and other stakeholders to identify the areas where these things stack and bubble up to the top that warrant this added level of Act 250 oversight. That is an option. That's not an uncommon approach to this sort of exercise. Another option is to build a step in before the regional planning process, to reconvene a working group of stakeholders, experts, practitioners, to do some of this analysis, and to basically report back out to you all, to the regional planning commissions, what their findings are, and suggest what a more refined version of a critical resource area would be that is targeted, that is less encompassing than the significant areas that have been discussed so far, and that really target resources and levels of protection in places that there's great agreement that's appropriate and necessary. And that second option, which we support or recommend. Either of these approaches really must involve robust public outreach and engagement. As many of you will recall in yes.
Sorry, did I miss this final paragraph on page 6? Either approach should consider.
Oh, I'm sorry. So either of those approaches, as I was saying earlier, should not only be looking at, we recommend not only look at resources that are present, but to the extent we can, look at areas that elements of risk. Like, where have we seen trends around subdivision? Where have we seen new E911 addresses open up? Where are we seeing the most pressure in the state? And can we use that as another tool to help inform where we would want to see these restrictions? Again,
I'm sorry, but what does that mean to you? Does that mean where we've already seen a lot of development, we should be more concerned or less concerned?
If we're seeing areas that have a high level of resource value and high development pressure through those trends, those are areas that we might want to see more regulatory oversight. If we see areas that have high resource value and there's very little development pressure, that may not be the most efficient place to leverage more regulation.
Sadly, where you've seen high development and resources that are at risk, you're already going to that second tier we started talking about of public resources going back for remediation as opposed to prevention is the way I would see that happening.
Fair. Again, this is, based on conversations with our staff, this was just an added lens that folks thought could be helpful. So just, I only have a couple more slides here and then I can wrap up. So either of these are,
Representative Tory has a question.
Just before we leave the topic of risk, you mentioned the municipal vulnerability index. Is that level of risk analysis something that would also be possible and useful for protecting?
I think so. Yeah. I think so very much. Yes. So either of these approaches.
And if Bongard-
Just have this rolling on my head, so I want to say it. This whole process that you keep talking about and communities making the decisions about what are critical resources areas. I get it, I guess, but that then tends to involve like thinking through a lot of, not necessarily their resource value alone. And I guess when I think about some of this stuff, like a connecting habitat is a connecting habitat, period. And I'm not sure about the process we need to figure out to know what to do if it, if it's a critical connecting habitat or if it's a headwaters. It just seems to me we ought to protect them. So I'm trying to get my arms around all of this process around this, and I get process and I get buy-in and I get all of that, but then I'm also thinking, it's a headwaters and it's a period. It's a headwaters.
Fair. So connecting habitat is an issue that I'm more familiar with. Vermont Conservation Design identifies 2.8 million acres of highest priority connecting habitat. Your bill has a definition for, I think, habitat connector or connecting habitat, which is quite broad. I don't have it in front of me, but to paraphrase, it's, natural cover that connects areas of other habitat. I think our scientists would say that not every one of those acres of connecting habitat necessitates Act 250 review. So it's going that next step down of, yeah, absolutely, that interconnected network of interior forest blocks and connecting habitat that Vermont Conservation Design captures is critical. It can absorb some impacts. What are the places that can't absorb those impacts?
That would be the critical part.
Right. And then how do we identify those? What metrics do we use? How do we square those with other community objectives? And then let's serve that up as the places where we do this.
It's just in the end, I want to make sure we end up actually protecting it.
Right.
Because if it's critical connecting habitat, it is critical connecting habitat. And so the alternative object, I don't know, I just want to flag that as something that I'm.
We share that, right? I think, our agency built Vermont Conservation Design with partners. I know you heard from Mr. Swanson earlier, when you considered this bill, he was an architect of that, now retired. I think some of his comments suggest that, we need to be thoughtful about how we actually establish these critical resource areas, because not every mapped resource in its totality is critical. We need to kind of drill down a little bit. And that's really all we're talking about, is how do we prioritize within those prioritized areas? I think the exercise we're embarking on under Act 59, the state's 30 by 30 bill, to identify priorities for conservation of 30% of the state by 2030. That's the exercise we're going to undertake. Vermont Conservation Design includes about 68% of the state's land mass. What 30% of that, or up to 50%, is the most important that we should focus our conservation efforts. So it's a similar analysis that I think we're talking about. And a couple of years ago, the General Assembly passed in Act 154, which came into law. It sets an environmental justice policy for the state. That's pretty explicit, that it says it's the policy of the state of Vermont to provide the opportunity for meaningful participation of all individuals in the development, implementation, and enforcement of any law, regulation, or policy. We take that seriously at the agency. We've built up an environmental justice office. We've done a lot of work with our climate office to think about how we can integrate environmental justice principles in that work. And I've included some links here that kind of speak to recommendations we've made on how to the need to appropriately involve Vermonters who are going to be impacted by these sorts of land use legislations in the process, as well as some public engagement processes we've developed in other contexts that could serve as a model. And then the last thing I'll say is that, and you may hear more from the NRB on this, but there's a lot of change being proposed in H687, and my agency's supportive of much of it, much of the kind of high level concepts, including the professionalization of the Natural Resources Board. And we think that there's value in letting that board get appointed, seated, and get their sea legs before dramatically changing the jurisdictional framework of Act 250, and that there may be some sequencing, natural sequencing that allows this additional work to happen to refine these critical resource areas, to come up with locations that are more targeted than what we're talking about today, and have that ready for when this new board is in place to begin to implement. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for your testimony. We took some pretty almost shocking testimony earlier today from a woman from Heinsberg about development in their floodplain, and the expectation, or the actually current application, to continue encroaching into that floodplain, which has flooded pretty severely in the past year, 8 months, twice. So, and the ask was that the state kind of start taking responsibility for the waters of the state of Vermont and the flood risks associated with it, and actually develop policies that would give towns a little more authority, or not put them in the position of having to regulate that every time a developer comes along. And I guess I'm struggling to how I resolve that, which I think I'm sad I'm shocked that someone's proposing another development in a floodplain. And I don't know how to reconcile what you're recommending, pump the brakes, engage local communities, when we have obligations both under the Clean Water Act, but also just based on common sense to keep people out of harm's way, that we wait to regulate some of these resources.
Certainly. That's a fair question. I'm not familiar with the testimony you heard earlier. I know that my office has been involved in a couple different Act 250 projects in Heinsberg Village, where the floodways criteria has been an issue, where we have been advising against approving a pending application because the project does not comply with our flood hazard recorder procedure, because it has an adverse impact to flood elevations. So
people were right, and it did, and they permitted it anyway.
Yeah, right. So what as this is happening in the other body and under another bill, we have proposed establishing minimum state floodplain regulations that all towns need to adhere to. Any town that's in NFIP needs to set that as their minimum, with the goal of leveling the playing field so that there is adequate protection at the municipal level for these resources. It addresses floodproofing, elevation, and importantly, the no adverse rise. So if you're building in a floodplain, you cannot take up floodplain storage. If you're going to add fill, you need to compensate for that fill elsewhere to have no net rise. So we're proposing that we establish a minimum state standard for floodplains so that there's really a clear standard at the municipal level for these sorts of projects.
And you're supporting that bill?
We're supporting that proposal to address the floodplain issue.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. that proposal of the minimum state floodplain requirement, we also heard testimony this morning about the fact that, there's a disconnect between FEMA floodplain and then like erosive flooding, as well as, I didn't quite get if it's fluvial or alluvial, but basically the other two types of flooding that, is also critical and so unique, not unique, but very common here in Vermont. Wondering if those bylaws, would that be expansive or would it just be like this type of flooding?
The minimum floodplain standard would apply to more of the traditional inundation flooding, that the fluvial, and it is within F, but close. That is also addressed in S213, which is a bill in the Senate right now. We have proposed a process to phase in expansion of existing DEC permitting over river corridors, which is the kind of area that addresses that fluvial impact. It's in a different time frame than what's currently proposed in that bill, but I believe we've proposed a pathway to expand state regulations of those areas.
And erosive?
Yeah, that's the erosive. So inundation is like the slow rise out into the floodplain. And then the river corridor concept is the area where rivers can migrate during high flow events through erosion and whatnot. And that second piece that we propose, this phase in of an expanded permitting program, is to address those sorts of things.
Representative Sapkowitz.
So you're concerned that there would be that too much land could potentially be taken in under critical resource areas. But we just passed a law that says that we want to protect from development 50% of the state by 2050. That's a big chunk of the state. And so how much of that 50%, like what are the relative sizes that seem reasonable to you? It seems like we've already decided as a state that we have these goals. And if the critical resource areas are going to fall, much, much underneath that, then that seems to be a contradiction in terms of where we're trying to go according to what we already have in statute.
Sure. So, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, from our perspective, the issue is about the capacity and resource it needs required to manage statewide permitting at that level under Act 250's 11 criteria or 10 criteria and 32 sub-criteria. It's a tremendous enterprise to pursue an Act 250 permit. And if we expand dramatically the scale of development and the areas that those permits are necessary, that creates a lot more work on the system for our agency, for Vermonters. And we're happy to do that work, but we want to do it in a targeted and strategic way. And I think the concepts of this bill are a very good start to that strategic targeted increase of automatic jurisdiction, but we feel like more work is needed to narrow that. The other thing I would say is that Act 59 relies heavily or contemplates significant amounts of our landscape being in active forest management and potentially areas that are managed for agriculture. I believe that the critical resource areas would require Act 250 permits for agriculture and forestry in critical resource areas. So that's another significant disconnect from Act 59.
Follow up on another point. Moments ago,
As Billy leaves, it'll come back. It's on my mind.
I don't feel so bad now.
Further questions?
Thank you very much for having us back in. I'm sorry I can't give you anything more concrete, but I really do think there is this incredible opportunity to take the concepts you've all put out there, the work of this committee, of the study group, and really, with a little bit more investment of time, get this to a place that is going to have a pretty broad support by Vermonters. So thank you.
I think we got our question back. We'd have another.
Sir,
Yeah, so I understand the sort of physical constraints of actually doing the work that you're talking about. That makes a lot of sense. You part, and I think that is informing, you said a little bit ago about that the areas that we should be looking at first are areas that are the nearest to development pressure. That should be part of how we analyze what areas we want to include in critical resource areas, at least at the beginning. I do worry, and I think this follows up on the point that Sheldon was making earlier, that it seems like it kind of puts us in a funny place. Like, those are exactly where we're going to have the most conflict over what we're trying to do. And if we were to be protecting in critical resource areas, places that are not under development pressure or likely development pressure in the near future, those are going to be sort of the easiest places where we're going to have the least amount of pushback on them. But then they'd be protected and presumably remain so for a long period of time. So it feels like a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a disconnect but it feels problematic that we would be focusing our efforts on the places which are going to be the most contentious when we could be protecting equally valuable resources with very little or much less friction. Understanding that maybe doing it all is an awful lot of work, but it just seems like there's a tension there that I'm not sure how to resolve.
yeah, no, that's fair. And I think there is a tension. And, again, the suggestion was more as we're identifying areas that have high natural resource value, can we also identify areas that have a higher risk or threat to development? Because that's where, we kind of need to get there first, right? The areas that have a lower risk of development maybe are less of a priority to regulate right now because maybe nothing's going to happen there. So it's just doing that analysis through the regional planning process, looking at all they're doing with their future land use maps, the different growth designations that they're going to establish through that process, and looking collectively at pressures, desires, resources, and coming up with this matrix of land uses and regulatory frameworks that work for our communities, that work for our natural resources.
Do you think there's a danger that we could be pushing, if we did that, where we really prioritize the places where the development pressure is the highest, that we could be, and we did map those places as critical resource areas, that we could then be pushing the development pressure to those places which are similar but are not, in that bucket because they're not under that pressure?
Sure, it's possible, but I think you're also contemplating a road rule which would capture much of the state off, a certain distance off the town roads, right? So a lot of these places that rank high from a resource perspective, maybe interior forest blocks connecting habitat that's far off of roads. Those places are largely going to be covered through the road rule, right? So we're talking about places that don't trigger the road rule, that have resource values. Where are they? What are their relative resources? And are there some risk things that we should take into consideration? The risk piece isn't a huge part of this. It just seems like an element and data that could inform the work that we're doing. A good plan.
But if we did accept the road rule that was that encompassing, wouldn't that also be problematic then for the reasons you gave
Well,
earlier, because it's going to put a lot more land into Act 250?
The NRB study recommended a road rule of 2,000 feet of cumulative roads and drives, which our agency supports. We think that's,
But that's not the rule you were just referring to.
My apologies. I know that Mr. Sheep was in here talking about a version of the NRB's recommendation that added an 800-foot trigger. That's something we would certainly consider if the other kind of consensus members of the study committee were interested in talking about that. So I think the road rule concept is one that we've supported for some time that I think would address, some of the issues you're raising. And yeah, Good. I appreciate your points. I don't want us to lose focus on the resources and focus too much on the risk. That was not the primary thing I was trying to say. That was just an element that could be included in the analysis. So thanks for that feedback.
We took testimony this morning on Headwaters, and we were shown a list of candidates for Class A reclassification. And I guess I'm curious, and also a thought that they should be considered critical resources. I'm curious, up in reclassifying these waters as Class A, and I think you've been doing natural resource work for a long time. What are your own personal thoughts on what a critical resource area is? And
Sure. So on the high class waters, that's not a piece that I work too directly on in the agency. My understanding is that the process currently requires municipalities to kind of sponsor or support the upclassification of those waters, and I may have that wrong.
that's true.
And I just don't know that there's been a lot of uptake by municipalities to do so. So that's the extent of my understanding on that. And as far as what I think are critical resource areas, I think about places where that are effectively keystones, where if there's even a relatively small amount of impact, that impact can either sever the overall function of that resource or have a radiating impact that is significant. And I think about some of the really key areas of regional connection that we have in the state, like Shutesville Hill, Blueberry Hill down in the Rutland area, and a few other places where we have these fairly narrow connections from the Adirondacks through the Taconics, through the Greens, up into the Northern Forest. I think, those are the sorts of areas that if we lose them, there are no alternatives for that ecological connectivity. And that's a subset of, Vermont conservation design. VCD buffers all those areas, but those specific kind of pinch points is certainly a subset and a place that I think we could do some work to identify. I think there are some outstanding examples of natural communities, state significant natural communities that are, particularly unique or rare or, the only example at that quality and size. Those are things that we should be, we might want to think about where additional protections would be appropriate. I do agree that increased protection of floodplains and river corridors is important from a resilience and an ecological perspective. I personally feel that work is better done through media permits in DEC rather than Act 250. I feel like managing that on a systems level around the functions and values that those floodplains and river corridors provide is better done through a traditional permitting program than through Act 250. There's just a lot happening with Act 250 that can make the focus on the floodplain and river corridor protection more difficult. But that's a place where I do think we should see some expansion of those programs in the future. And just like for context, everyone that I work with, I've been asking this question, like, where do you think a critical resource should be? I had John Austin here with me last time. I talked with him and his staff a lot. I talked with the attorneys and planners that work for me and represent us in Act 250. And, everyone has some senses of, well, maybe here, maybe there, but there's not a clear vision, but everyone agrees that with some work we could get there. So that's, it's not meant to be a punt, but that is what I'm hearing from the folks who do this work.
Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute break.